Welcome to a video on the Max Gunther DB Cooper letters. The audience is the Cooper Vortex and Cooper researchers and fans. Here, the Cooper Vortex does not always equal the Cooper case. There are slight differences. You can be in one and not the other, or both. I assume that people know about DB Cooper, Max Gunther, and Barb Dayton. The presentation will be somewhat technically focused, as some themes will be used in professional development seminar at a future time. I'm not a YouTuber, so being fancy is not my goal. There's a lot of information here, and I'll go quickly at points, so pause or slow down the video if needed. The presentation here will be in two parts. The longest part is part one, the science. There'll be a background about the letters, Max Gunther and Barb, and the Cooper Vortex podcast. Talk about stylometry, get into some software analysis, and a conclusion. If you're interested in more than just the science and want to hear a little bit more about Barb Dayton, go ahead and watch part two as well. Here's some background on the story and Max Gunther, a well-respected author who wrote the book DB Cooper, What Really Happened, which contained the letters that we're talking about today. In November 1971, Flight 305 was hijacked. In February 1972, Max received a letter from a man claiming to be DB Cooper. He's told to put an ad in the New York City newspaper, The Village Voice. March 2nd, the ad is placed. March 10th, Max and others receive a second letter from the man. In April of 1972, Max received a phone call from the man. 10 years later, after not hearing anything, Max receives a series of phone calls from a woman claiming to be Clara from the original letters and the ad. December 1982, Clara sends a letter to Ralph Himmelsbach, and Max Gunther gets a copy of that. In 1985, Max Gunther published his book, DB Cooper, What Really Happened. Here on the right, you'll see the actual ad that was in the Village Voice. This is out of the book that Max wrote, but I've actually seen the newspaper on microfiche to show that there really was an ad placed in 1972 with Max's name and the name Clara. This is the actual letter sent to Ralph Himmelsbach in 1982 from Clara and the envelope, and you'll see that it is postmarked New York City. Again, I'm assuming everyone has read the book or is familiar with the Dan LeClaire Clara situation enough to understand the video. Just to summarize here, there were multiple letters that were postmarked New York City. Gunther believes Clara called from New York. There's references to Newark, New Jersey, Boston, Massachusetts, and Canada. There's reference to Rutgers University in New Jersey. The letter writer caller knew the phone booth and phone number in the Pan Am building in New York City. He called two other publishers at least, and the book has a Northeast flair to things. And there's a whole bunch of other parts of the book, but that's the general concept here. And if you want more information on Gunther, the book, or anything like that, you can go to my website, dbcooperhijack.com. In March, the Cooper Vortex podcast had a guest, Martin Andrade, on. He used a concept called stylometry in an attempt to identify authorship of the letters. In that podcast, he used terms like statistically significant, 98% match, and controls. I believe it was a very good effort. However, I think the analysis was incomplete, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and refute some of the claims that were made on the podcast. What is stylometry? Stylometry uses statistical methods to analyze style in order to determine authorship. Style plus measurement equals stylometry. It's largely based on attribution studies and computational linguistics, but it can also be used for forensic analysis. Most consider stylometry to be some sort of subset of forensic analysis. This kind of study assumes that individuals or authors are unique and that such uniqueness is enacted in writing. Probably one of the most famous pieces of forensic linguistics was done with the Unabomber. Not a lot of stylometry was used there. However, stylometry has been used in the Harry Potter J.K. Rowling situation, where she was identified as having penned a second novel, and also in the Federalist Papers, which have always had a question as to who wrote which ones, either John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, or James Madison. As I mentioned before, stylometry is statistically based, computer-based, software-based. So just some relevant pieces of my background that make me generally qualified to have one of these discussions, or at least sit at the table on it. I'm Currently an operations research and systems analyst for the U.S. Army. I have an MBA in operations management. I'm working on a master's degree in statistics. I've worked in the military and in Fortune 500 companies in operations and supply chain. And recent graduate courses that I've taken to stay relevant, different types of statistics, applied statistics, calculus, applied calculus, statistical models, data analysis, OR, and probability. And software programs that I'm proficient in, this isn't everything, but these are ones that I've used consistently in my jobs throughout the years. Tableau, R, Python, and code in SQL, HTML, VBA. Some of those are kind of archaic now. Excel, Access, SPSS, which is a statistical program. I've done a number of coding boot camps and seminars. And way back when I was going through grad school, I was a graduate assistant in information systems where I taught business undergrads, Excel, Access, and other programs. I actually first got involved with Stylometry in July of 2018, just a couple months after joining the DB Cooper forum. I was doing some research on different people that were posting, trying to figure out if there were duplicate posters. So I downloaded Signature at that time. You can see here where actually I had to go back to one of my old laptops to find the program. That was July of 2018. So this is not my first foray into Stylometry or the Signature program. Here on the left is the Clara letter, and on the right is the Barb letter. You can clearly see that they're two different letters. So someone doesn't need necessarily software, a lot of training to understand that the letters are clearly written by two different people. The Clara individual is a good qualified typist. They don't make any mistakes, actually. The salutation is there. You can notice with the arrows, there's a lot of dashes at the end of the carriage returns, which is shows a trained typist. Whereas the Barb letter is filled with a number of mistakes and just looks completely different. So even without software, one can tell that they're probably two different people. Here's another view of those two letters, and on the right is the Barb letter actually typed out, and I did that to upload it into a program, as I did with a number of other letters. You'll see here that there's a number of misspellings and just general mistakes that make this individual very different than the one on the left. And remember, these aren't word processors, these are typewriters. Someone clearly either was very well trained that wrote the one on the left or spent a lot of time writing that letter. Here's another view of the two letters, Clara letter on the left, and on the right is the Barb letter that I dictated and typed out to be loaded into the software programs. You can see that Barb makes quite a few mistakes here, misprints, so on and so forth, compared to the letter on the left that was written by someone clearly more qualified. Here's another example of where you might not necessarily need a high-end, high-tech software program, just using available tools on the internet and Microsoft Excel. I've listed out the words that were only in Barb's letter in the blue, words only in the Clara letter in green, and then what we call function words on the left, which are shorter words, most commonly used words, I and you, so on and so forth. So again, even without a lot of software and statistical analysis, you can see that the word use is clearly different between Barb and Clara. Here we can see Microsoft Word counts the words for us, and we see the Barb letter and the Clara letter are both under 300 words, which is common for a letter. Okay, let's get deep into the analysis part here. These are examples of some of the letters that I transcribed that I loaded into the software programs that we'll talk about. We've got some Zodiac letters, the John Benet Ransom letter, letters from Walter Reca, letters from Franklin Roosevelt, ransom letter, one of the ransom letters for the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, as well as a letter written to the Oregonian from someone claiming to be DB Cooper. We're going to discuss three software programs for Stylometry. These are the three most well-known at this point that are available to the general public. First is going to be Signature 1.0. That was what was used for the analysis talked about on the podcast. Signature 2.0 is currently not available. I actually have emailed with the creator of Signature, and he asked me if I thought we should, bring out a signature 2.0. I said it'd be great if we do. He's used it, he has it, it's just not available to the public. It is a much better program than the original signature 1.0. The other two programs that we'll use are JGAP, which is a Java-based program. It's the Java Graphical Authorship Attribution Program. And then the other one is the most current, which would be from the R software environment called R Stylo, Stylometry for short. R is a language and environment for statistical computing and graphics. Here are the three main programs that we're going to be talking about. This visual comes from Temple University, where they reviewed the three most well-known stylometry programs. Signature being the first one on the left, created in 2003 by Peter Millikan of Oxford University. The major advantages of Signature are the graphics, the interface. It makes visualizations very quickly, so it's easy for a user and someone that's unfamiliar with coding or statistics. It does have its disadvantages. It only offers 5 analytical options and can't combine those. There's no active research community, has limited options for further visualizations, and stated before, there's no evidence of a Signature 2.0 coming out for the public, so it's not considered a sustainable platform. JGAP does provide extensive analytical customizations. There's a lot of extras in there, and I do like it. It has analysis methods like Burroughs Delta, for instance. The disadvantages of JGAP would be there's not a lot of visual there, hardly any. For somebody that's in data analysis, sometimes you'd like that. There is a comprehensive user guide, but it basically goes only back to begins at 2013. So there's not a whole lot of updating since then. The note here, one of the other well-known professors besides Professor Millikan is a gentleman named Professor Jwala, and he used this program working on the J.K. Rowling book that I had mentioned earlier. R Stylo is the third one, and this is from that coding programming language. I've called out here, R is the preferred platform for textual analysis, provides the most comprehensive and most customizable analytical options for stylometry. And the major disadvantage is it requires some coding knowledge, a good amount actually, so there is a significant learning curve. If I could combine all three of these into one, I would. I like the visuals of Signature. I like the many choices of JGAP, and I like the benefit of Style that has all those choices. It's customizable. It has a research community. I continue to add to it, but I would love the visuals of Signature and JGAP combined with the capabilities of R Stylo. Okay, let's get into the first program, Signature. And Signature was the program used by Marty to analyze the letters for the podcast. Going quickly through these, and some of it will be technical. Again, if you wanted to take more of a look, you can pause or slow down the video. You'll see the Signature interface. On the upper left there in red is where I've loaded a bunch of the text. Same thing on the lower right. And then in the lower right of each one of those pictures, you'll see the breakout of what's measured. So we have word length, sentence length, paragraph length, letters, and punctuation. You'll notice the chart in the upper right. That's the Clara and the Barb letter together. And then lower right is Salem's Lot and the Stand, which are by Stephen King. I took a couple chapters of each. And you'll see where we know for sure those were both written by Stephen King. It's a much smoother looking chart. So sample size really does matter. The Barb and the Clara letters are, essentially less than 300 words. Keep that in mind. I'll get to more into that here later. Whereas the Stephen King one is considerably longer. It's just better to use with something that's longer. See the Barb and the Clara letters visually overlaid. You can see by sentence length, this graph chart shows a significant difference, as does the percentages down below. Here you can see using Signature program that the letters overlaid visually, Barb and Clara, look very similar to Clara and Lindbergh. In the Cooper Vortex podcast, statistical significance at the 97-98% level was mentioned. I have to note that that's not the same as getting 98% on a test or hitting 980 in baseball. That used a chi-square test, which does require large sample sizes. Use hypothesis testing. Hypothesis is just a supposition or proposed explanation based off limited evidence. Statistical significance does not indicate on its own that the result is true or that the null hypothesis is false. It does not indicate or imply that a result is clinically important. Statistical significance is not practical significance. You have to use reality by, say, comparing two letters visually, and the controls need to be relevant. So if I use a book as a control against a 300-word letter, it is not a apples to apples comparison. Now here in the next few slides, I'm just going to show you some examples of where I use the same concept of analysis on the Barb letter to her kids and the Clara letter against other letters. So you'll see in the red which letters I used, and you'll see here at the bottom in red as well that the chi-square value is at the 20th, not significant at the 20%. You'll see different chi-square values here. I would not get too deep into those. In some cases, the lower chi-squared is significantly better than the other one. But here, I'm just explaining that the program can essentially pull out all sorts of different information on different types of letters, and there's not really any manipulation one can do to get this. So this is just putting the information in and seeing what comes out, and I recommend anybody that wants to, they can download the program and play around with it. So in this case here, using the same concepts, we determined that Barb is actually Walter Recca because her letter matches up with one of the Recca letters. So maybe those two were in cahoots. As noted before, I mentioned that sample size matters. Here's an actual visual of that. In terms of sentence length, we were not able to get any statistical analysis from the Barb and Clara letters, but you can see as we raise the sample size up over well into the 10,000s here that you actually will get some measurement. But even that, the program did not perfectly identify that Stephen King wrote both Salem's Lot and The Stand. You need more than just a one quick look. Here we know using punctuation that the Barb letter compared to the Recca FBI sort of confession letter shows that maybe Barb actually helped Walter Recca with that letter and that confession. So that's something we can add to the Vortex if people want to follow this as gospel. I did note a glitch here in the system. The chi-squared showing 1.64 down here and a 0.0 up there, which would potentially indicate that the Barb letter is closer to the Recca letter than it is to the Clara letter. Here again, we see that sample size matters in terms of paragraph length. We don't get any readout from the Barb and the Clara letter, but we do for the Stephen King books. As I noted before, there's only 5 options in this program, and the initial analysis of the podcast only used 3 of the 5. So we've shown issues with even the 3 that were used, but the ability to use more than that is just not possible. This here on letter use would indicate that Barb either kidnapped a Lindbergh baby or wrote a hoax for that baby, which was probably actually well before she was even born. Here we could argue that Walter Recca actually wrote the Clara letter. As you can see, I've compared it to 2 of his. You get the same setup as was talked about in the podcast. So the conclusion would be Walter Recca is Clara. I could argue that any of the hoaxers could be Clara. I think I mentioned that earlier. Here's a quote from a well-known researcher in the case who was talking about the podcast, and he said, I guess that's where I'm somewhat intrigued by it. It's a 97% match to a person who is already a known DB Cooper bullshitter. So I can guarantee that if I got information or letters from Dwayne Weber or Gossett or anybody else using the signature program and the concepts in the podcast, I could tie anybody to Clara, not just Barb. And finally, the last visual on signature, we took the Max letter, which is the original letter written in 1972 to Gunther. We can conclude that Stephen King was the writer of that letter, and then he followed on by writing his bestseller book, Carrie. And closing out the signature program, this is a quote from the actual inventor of the program, Professor Peter Millikan, who I've communicated with, as I've stated. He says, it becomes quite obvious that samples shorter than 5,000 words provide a poor guessing because they can be immensely affected by random noise. Below the size of 3,000 words, the obtained results are simply disastrous. Okay, let's get into JGAP, the Java-based program for our second of third programs. You'll see here the interface for JGAP. We've loaded the unknown author being Clara and a bunch of the known authors down below here, Zodiac, Lindbergh, Oregonian, John Bonet. Also note that Mark S. on Facebook has done similar work in this. He's somebody good to talk to. And what we did here was, or I did, was I combined all three Barb letters together to try to increase the sample size, which still does not increase it that much. That's all we have. So if we could get upwards of 10,000 words in a letter, we might have better luck, but I think it's going to show the same issues with Barb. Here on the left, you can see event drivers, and this is not everything. There's quite a bit in there that you can choose from. You can choose syllables per word, n-grams, sentences, so on and so forth. So I pulled some of the big ones: character n-grams, lexical frequencies. I'd have to get with you offline to describe and explain all those. It would take a lot more time. Sentence length. Word n-grams, we talk characters or words. Characters would be like A's, B's, C's. Words would be yes, no, maybe, so on and so forth. Punctuation, syllable transition, so on and so forth. Here are the analysis methods that were used. There was a number to choose from, but I chose three what I would consider important ones. The first two are good for stylometry. Third one is just generally for statistics, but it's interesting to research in different aspects, different avenues. They want to call out Burroughs delta, which is the most established measure for stylometric difference in literary authorship attribution. Several improvements on the original delta have been proposed. However, recent empirical studies showed that none of the proposed variants constitute a major improvement in terms of authorship attribution performance. This is the output for JGAP. You can clearly see graphically it's just not as appealing as signature, but it does give us some good information. Using the Burroughs delta centroid method, we determined that the Clara letter is most closely related to the Lindbergh baby ransom, which would be indicative of her writing that ransom. But falling close behind are the Recca letter and the Zodiac letters. Then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, more Recca letters, another Lindbergh letter. So she could be Recca, could be Zodiac as well. The Barb letter falls pretty low on the scale, considerably there at the bottom. Here we use the JW cross entropy window size program. The J in the JW is Professor Jwala, who invented the program. Here we conclude that Clara is actually Stephen King, and she's more likely the author of the John Benet Ramsey letter than she is the Barb letters. And finally, for JGAP, using the Markov chain analysis, we conclude here that Clara could be Donald Ritchie, who was a curator of film at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. That was a 1973 letter, so actually using letters from that same time period, roughly. And the rating of 647 for Donald Ritchie is significantly better than the 360 for Barb, and falls below Stephen King. So again, Clara might actually be Stephen King. Okay, here we're going to get into R Stylo, which is a package for the R programming languages. Think of a package as software. I've installed different packages for this, being baseball statistics. I'm looking at web scraping, there's just all sorts of analysis software that one can use on R. Kind of complicated, but once you learn it, it's pretty interesting. Now, in case you were wondering how easy it is to use R, it's not. This is the interface screen. You can see quite a bit of coding. The library that I loaded here, you can see on the lower right the text that were loaded. So this is definitely not user friendly. The outputs are good, the information is good, but this isn't something you can just learn in a day. Lower right, you'll see some of the output. I'll zoom in on these and show you better output, but in this case here, just using 20 most frequent words in a covariance matrix, we determined that Barb, one of her letters, actually shows that she wrote the John Bonet ransom letter, possibly. It's what we call a GUI, graphic user interface, and this is one of ours GUIs where you can select different languages, you can select different statistics, minimum, maximum on word counts, characters, you can do cluster analysis, consensus trees, so on and so forth, principal component analysis. There was commentary on the podcast or another podcast that this stylometry works better in Polish than English or vice versa, which simply not the case. So I'm just throwing that out there. But if you want to do things in Polish, you can see that on the left here. Here's a cluster analysis. Cluster analysis is a statistical method for processing data. Works by organizing items into groups or clusters based on how closely associated they are. Think about if you're listening to Pandora, you might have a bunch of your favorite bands that play. Those will be clustered together. Same concepts for anything like that that's predictive. So in this case, we have a visual, and any letters that are closer together or very tightly together would indicate some sort of association. So you see Madison and Hamilton are tied closely together on the Federalist Papers here on the right. That's because the sample size is significant. You'll see that the Oregonian letter, which was famously used by the Rackstraw team, would be possibly written by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the presidents of the United States. Also, FDR would have written the Clara letter. You do see where the Stephen King ones are close together and the two Zodiac letters. I found some interesting combinations with the Zodiac letters. Stylometry has been used with Zodiac. It's been used with Forrest Fenn. It's been used with other crimes as well. But here you can see that one could possibly conclude that Franklin Delano Roosevelt might very well have been involved with some of the DB Cooper case, even though he died in 1945. Here, using 30 most frequent characters, a classic delta distance, Clara letter is most closely related to the John Bonet Ramsey letter again. Here we're using most frequent words and principal component analysis. In this case here, you can see in red that Clara is most closely related to Donald Ritchie, so that could indicate that she worked at the New York Museum of Art. You'll see here that the spread is completely different than every other spread out there. So depending on which program you use, what measurement you use, you might end up getting completely different results with such small sample sizes. Here we see 100 most frequent words, and this shows that Clara also is the individual that wrote the Zodiac Confession letter and the Zodiac San Francisco Examiner letter. Also noted over here, I pulled some posts from two separate screen names on the DB Cooper forum that I've long suspected have been the same person for many years. And signature just did not give me good information, so I threw that into this program, and interestingly enough, using about 6,500 words, just scraping those posts, pretty much identified that person is the same person. I blocked that out. That's just really for fun and information for the group. So it does work on larger sample sizes, considerably larger sample sizes, which I don't think we're going to get from Barb, and we won't get from Clara because we just only have the one Clara letter. Here you'll see what I call sort of a pseudo peer review, although peer review is something you'd have potentially a PhD dissertation reviewed by a number of other PhDs or scientists. In this case, it's reviewed by a colleague of mine. They actually got the Stylo program working faster than I did because I was busy trying to do it from scratch, writing all the code. They were just faster at it than I was and able to use the GUI. This is some of their results. So I would say this is more of a colleague review than necessarily a peer review. We're in different industries, but you can see where they've got different approaches. Clearly, the Clara letter is different than the Dayton letter, than the Gunther Cooper letter, which could indicate two people wrote the letters, and then the Gunther text. So take this for what you want. Clearly, Dayton's different than the group. This could indicate that Max Gunther had nothing to do with the letters. It could indicate that a male wrote the first letter and a female wrote the second letter, two different people. Here we have 100 most frequent words using a multi-dimensional scaling. We can see the Clara, Gunther, and Dayton letters are all clearly written by different people. And finally, for R, same colleague shows a most 100 frequent words, but a principal component analysis version 2, just a different version of that, shows differences as well. Now, I stated that the sample size needs to be bigger, but definitely R Stylo being a better program would lead to more indication that clearly 3 different people wrote those letters. But we just simply don't have enough to really totally say that that's a perfect solution or decision. That concludes part 1. Hopefully you weren't too bored by it and you learned something. I do applaud Marty's effort to add some analysis to our Cooper case, and to Darren for having that podcast. Both those guys are huge contributors to the case. Martin was one of the initial guys that got me involved, and I've had a great relationship with him and Darren. I do look forward to seeing more of their work. If you're interested in Barb Dayton, go ahead and continue to watch the video. If not, good luck with everything. Thanks. Okay, welcome to the second part. This is less scientific. This is about Barb Dayton, and it's just going to give I'm going to give some thoughts and let people think about things and come to your own conclusions on Barb and the Clara letters. This here is a timeline just to visually show people so they can sort of understand what went on. I'm not going to talk about Barb being DB Cooper. That's a whole separate presentation. There's just too many suspects for me to get into to promote or discount them. But in terms of Barb's life and how it relates to the letters, in 1971 we had the hijack. 1972, 2 letters came to Max Gunther and others, Mark Penzer and Ed Kuhn, who were both well-known writers and editors. Ed Kuhn actually had an obituary in the New York Times. It's usually pretty big time when you get to having your obituary there. Same thing in 72, there was an ad in the Village Voice and the phone call from, quote, DB Cooper. The Foremans met Barb in 1977 out on the West Coast. In 1979, this is important, Ron Foreman said that Barb is DB Cooper. He's the one who came up with the idea. I think in good faith or in jest, whatever he believed that was the case. Barb then took Ron's cue and starts to claim that she's DB Cooper. In 1982, we have phone calls from Clara and the Clara letter. You'll note that the ad in the Village Voice in 72, a New York City newspaper, did say happy birthday, Clara, from Max. So in 1982, if Barb had no involvement and wasn't even thinking about being DB Cooper till 1979, she simply could not have known that that initial letter or caller mentions Clara, right? So things start to fall apart there. In 1988, Barb retired from the University of Washington. There's a claim that she liked the Max Gunther book, but hated books. And I'm not so sure as to how she would have worked as a librarian, but clearly if she's living on the West Coast in 72 and 82, she's not going to be able to mail letters in New York City or make phone calls from New York City or understand parts of New York City like the Pan Am building and know the phone number there at a phone booth. So things start to get a little squirrely there in terms of trying to piece this together and make things work. 1985, Max publishes his book, DB Cooper, What Really Happened. In 2006, the Foremans go to the FBI about Barb. At no time did they mention anything about Clara or Max Gunther. I can say when I sent material to the FBI, I did reference that, although I didn't say that was the main reason for somebody potentially being DB Cooper. But you'd think that if Max Gunther played a major role, that would have helped the case. And then in 2008, the Foremans wrote the book, The Legend of DB Cooper. Here's one of the FBI 302s in 2006 on Barb. You can see where the Foremans went to the FBI. They talked about Barb, talked about her reassignment surgery, name, things like that, talking about how she knew planes and was potentially DB Cooper, so on and so forth. No mention at all of Gunther or Clara. And I'm not insinuating that the Foremans are lying at all. I just think that they probably got their timelines a little bit out of place and maybe have some potentially some wishful thinking. Here's another timeline just to put things in place for people to begin thinking about Barb as Clara. Sort of, to me, disproves it, debunks it. In 1962, Max Gunther wrote a True Magazine article on how to disappear. Barb apparently mentions this article many, many, many years later to the Foremans, and 30 years later, I guess they remembered the specific article, the conversation about the magazine, not exactly sure how that worked out. Hijack 1971, the letters to Max in 72. True publishes their last issue in 1975. Possible somebody's got a whole stack of these in their basement, which happens. I agree, it happened back in the 80s or whatever. Foremans meet Barb in 77. 79, Ron says Barb is DB Cooper. 1980, Barb rescinds her confession. Then the letters go to Clara, which are completely different than the stories told by Clara and DB Cooper, completely different than Barb's story. She has two completely different stories, which is hard to understand. 1985, Max has his book, and somewhere, we're not sure exactly when, she mentions the article from 1962, and then starts to mention Max's book sometime probably late 80s after it was published. 2006, we have the Foreman's book. In that book, the Foreman's book, they talk about the initial Max letter. So they're indicating that Barb would have been part of that initial letter as well, not just the Clara letter. And they talk about the signature having crossed out letters. Looks like a B that's crossed out. It's actually not a B. It doesn't look like a B if you look at it under magnification. It's clearly a D that's crossed out. I have my theories on that, as do other people, but there is reference to that in their book, trying to tie Barb to that letter through that situation, and just doesn't seem to work as well. So here's some notes here in conclusion to give people things to think about. We know Barb is a known storyteller, so you can imagine her stories might have motivated other people as well. Point being, she doesn't necessarily need to be Claire to be DB Cooper. She's got an interesting story as it is. A lot of people have tried to claim their suspect is Clara. I've heard Vordal. I've heard different other people as well. I think if you took writings from any of them, you'd be able to get them to potentially fit the same as Barb when it comes to those letters. Stylometry, both visually and systematically, have disproved that Barb is Clara. Common sense and the timeline show that Barb is not Clara. Marty's analysis was in good faith, and I know he doesn't have an agenda. The Foremans believe that Barb is Clara, but it just does not line up. I don't think they're lying. I think people forget. Timelines can be off. Even when I was talking about the Federalist letters earlier, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. Madison, when he was asked, which ones he wrote, he couldn't even remember how many of those he wrote. and he was president of the United States at the time. So, other questions to ask: why would others in the vortex be so adamant about making Barb to be Clara when they've gone out of their way to discredit Barb as Cooper? It seemed that people were not necessarily happy for the Foremans; they were happy for other reasons that Barb could potentially be Clara. Prior to the podcast, the group of people talking about Max Gunther fell into three major categories. You had a group that said Max made the whole thing up. You had a group that said Max was hoaxed, and the other group, which was small, that Max talked to the real DB Cooper. A few of us believe that. Martin Andrade was one of the original believers of that. I think for the past maybe couple years, there's been an effort to discredit Max. It's been very visible, but for some reason, people quickly fell for this one. So when they were saying Max made it up, Max was not trustworthy. All of a sudden, they felt that he was, because now they believe that Barb wrote the letters. There's been some quotes from people well known in the vortex that say you can tie anyone's life to the book. That's in justification that Max made it up, or somebody looking at that trying to tie a suspect to the book could do that. And then other people have said you can't tie anyone's life to the book. So I'm not sure which one you want to pick. If you can't tie anyone's life to the book, then you can't tie Barb. But I guess if you can tie anyone, you can tie Barb or whatever. So now all of a sudden connections start to matter. I'll get into that here a little bit, a couple more bullets down. As I stated before, the podcast did not result in people being happy for the Foremans. There was some talk about how great the analysis was, and I do appreciate the analysis. I really do. I do like that approach. I'd like to see more of that in the case. I think the podcast was used for other means, not by Darren or Marty, but just by other people. Jude did talk about other situations, but he walked back his claims, which is very rare in the vortex. So I've got to give kudos to Jude on that. He's familiar with R and familiar with sample size, so I do appreciate that. And now, as we discredit the whole Barb as Clara using stylometry, there's a new effort underway to still make her into Clara. Somehow she's connected to Washington, D.C., which I really see nothing there. That's just a very tiny mention in the book. There's a bunch of other things mentioned. Washington, D.C., I hardly ever use that. There's apparently Barb had some connection to Baltimore. I'm not sure exactly how, considering in the book by the Foreman, she gets all her surgeries in Washington, University of Washington, Washington State, which is across the ocean. And Baltimore is not Washington, D.C. I live pretty close to Washington, D.C. I was there 3 times this week. I was there last night. People from Baltimore don't say they're from D.C. You could live in Philadelphia and get to D.C. just as easy as Baltimore. People just don't travel here as much out of that city. So apparently Barb had a scar on her hand, unsubstantiated. Other suspects had scars on their hands, so they could be Clara or LeClaire in this case. Apparently Barb was close to her daughter. That's in the book, the Max Gunther book as well. But she left her daughter, so I'm kind of awaiting other examples of how people are going to connect Barb to the Max Gunther book. I've stated that I've kind of tried to leave the vortex, basically leaving the Facebook group, just some of the constant just interactions and repetitiveness. And so it's going to free up a lot of my time just to focus on the case, researching Gunther and other things. But in the end, I think the only thing that's going to probably solve this would be DNA. We do have DNA from the stamp. I'm in the process of getting more DNA tested. I'm waiting for technology to improve to use the DNA from the stamp to get what we call an SNP profile. There's been some criticism kind of insinuating that I could get it easily tested and rule out Barb. It's not as simple as that. Even talking to CC Moore the other day over email, if we use that DNA for a one-to-one STR test, it's going to ruin the DNA, and I can't get an SMP profile from it. So we're going to wait till we get an SMP profile so we can truly identify who licked that stamp and hopefully get us closer to finding out who Clara was. Thanks for watching.